The room was small, barely wider than the table at its center. Candlelight trembled along the walls, catching on ledgers, quills, and a single golden coin that spun slowly before coming to rest. Outside, Florence murmured beneath the rain. Inside, history was being rewritten not with swords or decrees, but with ink and silence. A man in merchant's robes leaned forward, his face calm, unreadable. Before him sat an emissary, draped in travel-stained velvet, hands clasped tightly as though in prayer. He had come to plead a kingdom's future. Yet the banker before him showed no sign of reverence, only precision. The merchant counted each coin aloud, his voice soft, measured. One after another, the sound filled the chamber like the ticking of an unseen clock. When he reached the end, he paused not to admire the gold, but to note a figure in a ledger whose margins already held the debts of half of Europe's nobility. With a faint nod, he closed the book. The emissary exhaled, a trembling breath of both relief and disbelief. Somewhere far from that room, a prince would soon be crowned Holy Roman Emperor. But the true coronation had just occurred here, witnessed by no crowd, recorded by no priest. This was Florence, in the 15th century, a city that appeared to worship art, beauty, and divine order, yet quietly bent its knee to another god entirely: gold, the invisible metal that moved through veins of parchment and seal, shaping empires more completely than any sword. The church might have condemned usury, but even bishops came here, under cover of night, to borrow what heaven could not provide. For centuries, we were told that power rested in thrones, that kings ruled by divine right, that crowns gleamed with the sanction of heaven. But in rooms like this, the truth whispered otherwise. It lived in the numbers that no chronicler bothered to record, in the contracts signed with trembling hands, in the silence of men who understood that influence meant nothing if it was seen. The man who decided who would become emperor never sat on a throne. His name appears in no ballads, and that was exactly how he wanted it. History remembers the noise, the battles, the coronations, the gilded processions through torchlit streets. It rarely remembers the silence that made all of it possible. The families who thrived in that silence understood something few dared to say aloud. Fame is a liability. To be visible is to be vulnerable. And so, while kings sought to be remembered, they worked to be forgotten. In the centuries that followed, their names dissolved like ink in water. Chroniclers, those self-appointed guardians of memory, were seldom impartial. They wrote for patrons, and those patrons preferred stories that glorified crowns, not creditors. When a banker funded a war, his name might appear once in the margins of a royal ledger, if at all. When the same banker funded a cathedral, his name might be replaced by a saint's. That was not humility, it was strategy. In medieval Europe, history itself could be purchased. Monks who copied manuscripts might quietly omit a name in exchange for a generous donation. Court poets could shift blame or glory with a single verse. The families who understood this learned to move behind the curtain, guiding events while letting others take the bow. Some even paid chroniclers to exaggerate royal virtues, knowing that a celebrated monarch made an excellent shield. A forgotten banker, on the other hand, faced no rivals, no assassins, no envy, only time, which erased all traces of his control. The invisibility was cultivated through artful restraint. Their homes were grand but unadorned, their crests deliberately simple: no lions, no eagles, nothing that would catch the eye of a gossiping courtier. Their portraits, when they existed at all, depicted them as anonymous men of trade, never as the architects of destiny they truly were. Even marriages became acts of camouflage. Unions were framed as alliances of affection, yet behind every ceremony was an exchange: dowries that transferred influence, signatures that cemented dynasties, and promises that bound nations more tightly than any treaty. Sometimes entire documents vanished. Loan records burned mysteriously, seals dissolved, correspondence misplaced. The official histories of kingdoms show gaps, moments where cause and effect don't quite align, where fortune changes hands overnight. These gaps are not errors, they are footprints in the dark. They tell us that someone knew how to make power disappear. And yet, this vanishing act did not end with the Middle Ages. The art of erasing oneself from the narrative of shaping the story while remaining unseen has endured. Modern power wears different clothes now, but it still hides behind philanthropy, institutions, and carefully managed public images. What has changed is only the medium. When you're powerful enough to hire the people who write history, you can choose whether you appear in it at all. And sometimes, the greatest mark of influence is not presence but absence. Because in the long corridors of time, the loudest names fade. The quiet ones, the ones never spoken, endure. To understand how these unseen dynasties rose, one must first understand the world that allowed them to exist. Medieval Europe was not a continent of unity, but of fracture, a mosaic of duchies, republics, and kingdoms that shared borders but not loyalties. Each ruler was caught in a web of debts and rivalries, always one miscalculated campaign away from ruin. In such a landscape, gold was not merely currency, it was survival. The age's rulers discovered a quiet truth. When every neighboring kingdom is both potential ally and enemy, the man who can provide funds on short notice becomes indispensable. Armies could be raised in months, but trust took generations. The bankers who mastered this trust became the unseen spine of European politics. They lent to both sides of wars, secured peace treaties through loans, and created obligations that outlasted reigns. Their power was renewable, invisible, and far less risky than the sword. The Church's prohibition on usury lending money at interest should have stopped it all. Yet that very rule became the seed of a new order. Only a handful of families found ways to navigate its moral maze, inventing legal fictions that allowed profit without sin. They were neither knights nor nobles, but they soon found themselves advising both. When the Crusades began, knights sought redemption, bankers sought opportunity. They devised methods to transfer wealth safely across continents, birthing the earliest versions of modern credit. Pilgrims and princes alike carried letters bearing their seals, documents that promised gold upon arrival. Each letter was a key in a growing network of obligation. The more complex trade became, the more Europe needed men who could translate chaos into arithmetic. These families understood something the warriors never did. Real power comes from connecting what others cannot. Historians today call these structural holes, the spaces between systems where influence accumulates. In the medieval world, such holes were everywhere between church and state, Christian and Muslim, north and south. Those who stood at these crossroads became brokers of worlds. They were neither conquerors nor servants, but something rarer, intermediaries in a fragmented civilization desperate for order. And because they were needed everywhere, they belonged nowhere. In time, their ledgers became as significant as royal decrees, their signatures as binding as papal bulls. A continent divided by war was slowly stitched together by invisible hands. In a land of bankrupt kings and warring crowns, the man with gold didn't need an army. He was the reason armies existed at all. If the story so far has felt like a glimpse through a keyhole, what lies beyond the door is far more intricate. The threads of hidden power we've traced through Florence, through vanished names and unrecorded debts, were not isolated anomalies, they were the blueprint of an era. And the families who drew that blueprint shaped the foundation of the modern world, brick by unseen brick. In the chapters ahead, we will walk their corridors, some gilded, some shadowed. We will meet the Medici, who turned the art of banking into the architecture of empires. We will step into the counting houses of the Fuggers, who once decided who would sit upon the throne of the Holy Roman Empire with the stroke of a pen. We will sail to Venice, where families like the Barbarigo and the Loredan built an invisible web of trade and intelligence that reached from Alexandria to Antwerp. And we will look inside the papal chambers of Rome, where power wore robes instead of armor and bloodlines intertwined with sanctity itself. But this is not a parade of names and dates. It is a study in methods, the quiet machinery that converts gold into loyalty, trust into obedience, and invisibility into endurance. We will follow the logic behind their marriages, the symbols they wove into their art, the ledgers they guarded as if they were scripture. Every document, every crest, every rumor tells us something about how power learned to disguise itself. Yet the question that lingers, like a candle's smoke after flame, is not merely who these people were, but whether their kind ever truly vanished. For the systems they built did not end when their names faded. Their banks became institutions. Their marriages became dynasties. Their trade routes evolved into financial networks that still thread across continents. The tools have changed, but the hands that wield them feel strangely familiar. This journey is not a conspiracy. It is a reconstruction, a slow unveiling of how influence survives through adaptation and forgetting. We will show the documents, trace the signatures, map the inheritance of power from merchant tables to corporate towers. By the time you finish this journey, you'll recognize the patterns, and once you see them in the past, you'll start seeing them everywhere in the present. Some thrones, it turns out, were never meant to be seen at all. Gold glimmered like sunlight trapped in metal, but to those who truly understood its nature, gold alone was never enough. Medieval Europe was filled with men who possessed it, traders, merchants, and usurers whose fortunes could fill palaces. Yet most of them vanished from history. Their wealth died with them, melted down, divided, forgotten. What separated the few who endured from the countless who did not was not how much money they made, but what they turned it into. They discovered that gold, in itself, is inert. It does nothing until it moves. Power, on the other hand, is motion and energy that flows through people, institutions, and ideas. To turn one into the other required alchemy of a different kind. Not the transformation of metal into gold, but of gold into influence. They learned how to make wealth breathe. A simple loan could become a lever. A favor extended to a desperate prince could yield an empire's gratitude or its obedience. When the Fuggers financed an emperor's election, they didn't seek repayment in coin. They wanted mines, monopolies, and imperial privileges that no sword could seize. When the Medici funded a cardinal's ascent, it was not interest they demanded, but proximity to divine power. Each transaction was an investment in control, not profit. They lent to the powerful not because it was safe, but because being owed by a king was safer than being ignored by one. They understood relationships as capital. A marriage was a merger, a friendship with a bishop, an insurance policy, a well-placed gift to a courtier, an investment with invisible dividends. They built networks that bound money to loyalty and loyalty to survival. Where others saw gold as an end, they treated it as a beginning. Information was their second currency. Through merchants, clerks, and correspondents, they learned which monarchs were desperate, which popes were indebted, which wars were about to ignite. A timely loan, extended at the right moment, could purchase not just gratitude, but silence, secrecy, or even policy. And then there was leverage, the invisible scaffold beneath every throne. By becoming indispensable, they made rulers dependent. To govern, kings needed coin. To raise coin, they needed them. That dependence was their crown. Over generations, this system became self-sustaining. Gold flowed upward, power downward, each feeding the other. What began as commerce evolved into a quiet dominion that outlived kingdoms. They discovered something kings never understood. The man you owe money to has more power than the man you fear. And so, these families built their empires, not in castles or cathedrals, but in the spaces between where obligation met opportunity, and where the true architecture of power began to take form. Before the age of telegraphs and satellites, before spies hid behind code names and false passports, There were couriers, riders who carried secrets sealed in wax and folded between pages of trade accounts. From the counting houses of Florence and Augsburg to the porticos of Venice, the air hummed with the quiet traffic of letters. Within them moved not just numbers and transactions, but the lifeblood of power itself: information. These families discovered early what rulers would learn too late: that gold could open doors, but knowledge could open worlds. The Medici, the Fuggers, and the Venetian dynasties built networks that stretched across Christendom like invisible veins. Agents were stationed in Antwerp, London, Lisbon, Cairo, men who posed as merchants but functioned as the eyes and ears of their masters. Their letters reported the price of wheat, the rumor of war, the illness of a prince, the debts of a bishop. Each detail mattered. A king might wait weeks for his own messengers, yet these families knew his secrets before his own advisors did. When a northern frost destroyed harvests, they hoarded grain. When whispers of invasion spread across the Mediterranean, they diverted fleets before the first cannon fired. They profited not from chaos, but from foresight, the rarest commodity in Europe. Their correspondents developed a language all their own. A phrase about unfavorable weather might mean an unstable alliance. A mention of spices delayed at port could hide news of papal unrest. Letters were written in layers, innocent on the surface, revelatory to those who understood the code. Couriers carried them along routes so well guarded that entire monarchies relied on them for news. Some traveled under false names. Others carried empty sacks to mislead pursuers. To lose a message was to risk a fortune. Information became the great equalizer. It allowed a banker to predict a kingdom's rise or fall. It gave him the power to lend at the moment of desperation or to refuse, ensuring collapse. When the Fuggers learned that the French king's treasury was near exhaustion, they quietly extended credit to his enemies. When Venetian merchants learned of Ottoman troop movements before official envoys did, they shifted their convoys to safety and cornered trade markets that others thought lost. But these families were not passive collectors of secrets, they were architects of perception. They decided who knew what and when. A rumor delayed could change a treaty. A letter misdirected could turn allies into rivals. In time, they realized that information was not merely something to possess, but something to weaponize. To control information was to control time itself, to live a few steps ahead of every other player on the board. In a world where news traveled on horseback, that difference was everything. While kings waited weeks for messengers, these families already knew the future, because they were writing it. To understand how power endures, one must look not at battlefields or treaties, but at wedding altars. Beneath the silk veils and solemn vows of medieval Europe, empires were quietly merging. For the great banking families, marriage was not romance, it was strategy, written in ink rather than affection. Each union was a transaction designed to convert wealth into legitimacy and legitimacy into permanence. A merchant's fortune might buy a palace, but not a title. A noble's name might open doors, but without money, those doors led nowhere. The solution was elegant: combine them. A banker's daughter could marry a count's impoverished son, each side completing the other's deficiency. The dowry revived the noble estate. The title sanctified the merchant line. Within a generation, their children would be heirs to both. The Medici perfected this art. Their daughters entered noble houses across Italy. Their sons courted alliances with duchesses and princesses. Each match was calculated with the precision of a ledger. Behind the blessings and feasts lay pages of contracts, dowries, inheritances, clauses that specified not only money but influence, trade rights, ecclesiastical appointments, and even future votes in papal elections. These families kept meticulous genealogical records, maps of bloodlines as detailed as financial statements. They studied them the way generals study terrain, identifying weaknesses and opportunities. A noble family with dwindling heirs was an open gate. A count with many daughters, but no sons, presented a bargain waiting to be struck. Marriages were not isolated events. They were steps in multi-generational plans designed to weave merchant blood into the tapestry of nobility. Over time, their origins blurred. A banker's grandson might inherit a title once held by the same count who scorned his grandfather's merchant trade. Chroniclers, eager to please their patrons, quietly revised genealogies. Coats of arms absorbed new symbols, erasing the scent of commerce beneath layers of heraldry. The process was slow but relentless, a kind of social alchemy that transmuted gold into blue blood. Historians later gave it a name: bloodline laundering. It was not deceit, but evolution, a method by which power adapted to survive in a rigid hierarchy. Where others fought to storm the gates of nobility, these families simply married through them. And the pattern never ended. The names changed, the titles modernized, but the principle endured. In drawing rooms and boardrooms alike, wealth still seeks legitimacy, and legitimacy still hungers for wealth. The surnames may no longer sound Italian or German, but their unions echo the same logic. They didn't marry for love, they married for conquest, and their weapons were contracts, not swords. Power, however silent, cannot endure without a story to justify it. The great families of Europe understood that money and marriage might build their foundations, but only culture could make them eternal. They needed to be seen not as profiteers, but as patrons chosen by destiny to beautify the world. And so, they turned to art, architecture, and scholarship to clothe their ambition in virtue. In Florence, the Medici transformed patronage into propaganda. Their coins funded chapels, frescoes, and sculptures that told stories of divine favor and noble lineage. Artists painted them beside saints, angels, and kings, their faces inserted into sacred history with brushstrokes too elegant to question. Every church they built became a monument to their piety, every commission a sermon in marble. To the people, they were benefactors. To the discerning eye, they were branding themselves in eternity. Elsewhere, the Fuggers erected grand halls and funded cathedrals, blending commerce with sanctity. Venetian dynasties financed libraries that held the wisdom of the ancient world, quietly aligning their names with civilization itself. Patronage became the softest form of control. A commissioned artist owed gratitude. A scholar owed allegiance. A city adorned with your generosity could not easily turn against you. Their investments extended beyond beauty. They funded hospitals, universities, and charities not out of sentiment, but calculation. A hospital wing bearing their crest turned mercy into advertisement. A university endowed by their fortune became a factory of loyalty, educating generations beneath their emblem. Even death could not silence their reach. Foundations and trusts ensured that masses were said for their souls year after year, turning remembrance into ritual. Through art, they rewrote their origins. Painters traced their family lines to ancient heroes. Poets claimed divine omens at their births. Architects raised domes and palaces whose symmetry suggested cosmic order, as if geometry itself blessed their rule. Over time, the image became indistinguishable from truth. History, penned by those they employed, remembered them as visionaries rather than financiers. It was genius disguised as generosity. The more beauty they funded, the less anyone questioned the means that paid for it. And in that, they found immortality. Long after their banks closed and their ledgers turned to dust, their cathedrals still touched the sky, their names etched into marble, their portraits glowing in museum light. They realized that if you fund the artists who paint history, you get to choose how you're remembered. And centuries later, we still remember them exactly as they intended. Florence, in the late 13th century, was a city of color and tension, of gold, leaf, and gild feuds, of frescoes drying beside the clang of forges. In the narrow streets near the Arno, the Medici were known not as rulers or nobles, but as merchants. They dealt in wool, a trade that clothed Europe but offered little glory. Their hands counted coin and weighed cloth, not crowns. Yet from this modest commerce, a dynasty would rise that would one day make kings kneel. Giovanni de' Medici saw what others missed. The church, he realized, was not merely a spiritual power, it was the richest institution in the world. Its coffers overflowed with tithes and offerings sent from every corner of Christendom, yet its finances were chaotic. Giovanni offered order. By positioning the Medici Bank as the papacy's trusted financial partner, he gained not just wealth but proximity to God's earthly representatives. Through the ledgers of bishops and cardinals, he glimpsed the movements of kingdoms before they reached the throne rooms. This arrangement was genius disguised as service. The church needed discretion, and the Medici provided it. They handled the collection of indulgences, the transfer of donations, the management of diocesan accounts. But every transaction brought information: which cardinals were overextended, which families sought favor in Rome, which monarchs were courting papal approval. Giovanni did not speculate, he listened. And by the time his son Cosimo inherited the bank, the family possessed something rarer than gold: foresight. Cosimo de' Medici understood that the future of banking lay not in profit but in dependence. He loaned money to princes, to dukes, to the very men who claimed divine right to rule. To the King of France, he extended credit for diplomacy. To the English crown, he financed a war. To the Holy Roman Emperor, he advanced funds for troops. Each loan tied rulers to him like threads in a web. Debt became diplomacy. Cosimo could call in a loan to remind a monarch of his obligations, or forgive it to purchase loyalty. He could shift entire alliances with a signature. He had no army, yet his reach exceeded that of any general. When kings debated in their courts, they weighed not only policies but what the banker of Florence might do next. In Florence itself, Cosimo mastered another art, the illusion of humility. Officially, he was a private citizen, a servant of the Republic. Unofficially, he controlled its treasury, its elections, its future. He walked the streets without a crown, yet every door opened before him. The city called him Cosimo the Elder, not ruler but patriarch, as though the Republic simply chose to orbit him. He held no official position, commanded no army, wore no crown. Yet when Cosimo de' Medici spoke, Europe listened, because Europe owed him money. In the flickering half-light of Rome's cathedrals, where incense curled toward painted ceilings, the Medici found their most audacious opportunity. The papacy, the throne of St. Peter itself, was not beyond their reach. Giovanni de' Medici had laid the groundwork through loyalty and discretion, but it was Cosimo and his descendants who realized that the surest way to sanctify their power was to own the institution that defined sanctity. The church was divine in name but human in function. Its cardinals lived like princes, their crimson robes concealing debts as heavy as their jewels. They borrowed freely from the same Florentine bankers who financed their wars and palaces, and none were more generous or discreet than the Medici. Every unpaid loan, every note of credit, became a thread of quiet influence. And when the time came to elect a new pope, those threads converged inside the locked doors of the Sistine Chapel. The Medici did not bribe in coins alone. They forgave debts, funded villas, sponsored nephews. A cardinal who lived on Medici credit knew precisely where his allegiance lay. Through patience, calculation, and decades of grooming allies, the family transformed the College of Cardinals into an echo of their bank's ledgers. Those who owed the Medici favored Medici interests. Those who didn't soon found themselves in need of their help. The first triumph came with Giovanni de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who ascended to the papal throne in 1513 as Leo X. It was the ultimate alchemy. A banker's son now sat as God's representative on earth. "Since God has given us the papacy," he was said to remark, "let us enjoy it." Under Leo X, the flow of money between Rome and Florence became a river. Church revenues funded Medici projects, Medici appointments, and Medici art. Leo's reign marked the height of the family's divine consolidation. His indulgence sales, designed to refill the Vatican treasury, financed St. Peter's Basilica and, indirectly, the Reformation that would fracture Christendom. Clement VII, another Medici pope, continued the pattern. He navigated the Italian wars, excommunicated kings, and sought to protect Florence's interests above all else. When imperial troops sacked Rome in 1527, they found among its treasures the correspondence that confirmed what Europe had long suspected. The Medici had turned salvation itself into a currency. 4 Medici popes would eventually wear the tiara Leo X, Clement VII, Pius IV, and Leo XI, and through marriage alliances, their bloodline touched 2 more pontiffs. The Church, once the family's client, had become its crown. For ordinary believers, the notion was scandalous. For the Medici, it was inevitable. By the 16th century, they had achieved what no warrior could. They had fused heaven and earth into a single balance sheet. Divine authority now spoke with a Florentine accent. They didn't just buy influence in the church, they bought the church itself. And for 100 years, God's voice on earth spoke with the confidence of a banker who knew every soul was in his debt. Wealth could open doors, but not all of them. Even a family that financed popes still found itself gazed upon by old nobility with a mixture of awe and disdain. To the blue-blooded aristocracy of Europe, the Medici were still merchants, clever, yes, but common. Their gold might buy influence, but it could not erase the stain of trade. And so, the Medici embarked on their most ambitious project of all, the rewriting of blood itself. In Florence, Giovanni and Cosimo had purchased respectability through service and restraint. They funded churches, hospitals, and republics, but still, their names carried the scent of the counting house. The first phase of transformation began with modest alliances, marriages to minor Florentine nobles and wealthy merchant families. Each union was chosen with surgical precision. Enough prestige to elevate the name, enough loyalty to avoid betrayal. They built not just wealth, but belonging. Then came Lorenzo the Magnificent, the Golden Prince of Florence. In him, the Medici project reached its turning point. Lorenzo's marriage to Clarice Orsini in 1469 was no love match. It was a calculated leap across centuries of social division. The Orsini were among Rome's oldest families, bound by blood to the papacy itself. Clarice brought little fortune but immense legitimacy. By marrying her, Lorenzo purchased something no coin could buy: ancestry. Through Clarice, the Medici stepped onto the grand stage of European nobility. Her relatives filled the Vatican and commanded armies. Her name opened palaces that had long been closed to Florentine merchants. Lorenzo used these connections not to assimilate, but to expand. His sons entered the church, his daughters into aristocratic courts. When his son Giovanni became Pope Leo X, and his nephew Clement VII followed, the Medici ceased to be merely Florentine, they became continental. The family's blood strategy was methodical. They tracked genealogies like bankers tracked interest rates, identifying noble lines weakened by excess or misfortune. A daughter with no dowry but a prestigious name was worth more than gold. A young count with a title but no fortune could be quietly absorbed through marriage. The Medici rarely bought titles, they inherited them by design. The culmination came with Catherine de' Medici, Lorenzo's great-granddaughter. When she married Henry, Duke of Orleans, who would become King Henry II of France, Florence's merchants had placed one of their own on the French throne. From the banking halls of Tuscany to the royal palaces of Paris, the transformation was complete. The wool merchants had produced a queen. Catherine carried her family's genius for quiet control into the French court. She survived assassination plots, civil wars, and the ambitions of men who underestimated her. Her descendants ruled France for generations, her influence shaping European politics from behind the veil of royal etiquette. Later, Marie de' Medici, another scion of the family, would marry King Henry IV of France and serve as regent for their son, Louis XIII. The Medici had entered the bloodstream of monarchy itself. By the 17th century, no one dared speak of their mercantile origins. Chroniclers described them as ancient, noble, touched by destiny. Their heraldry hung beside that of emperors. Their sons and daughters were born into a world their ancestors could never have imagined. It had taken 6 generations of patience and calculation to wash away the scent of the marketplace. But when it was done, they stood not as servants to kings, but as their equals, queens, popes, and grand dukes, whose lineage was now considered as pure as the blood they had so carefully engineered. It took them 6 generations to erase the stain of commerce from their bloodline. But once they did, they weren't just nobles. They were queens and grand duchesses who made other monarchs feel inadequate. When the last male heir of the Medici line, Gian Gaston, died in 1737, Florence mourned what it thought was an ending. In truth, it was only a transformation. Dynasties die in name long before they vanish in influence. The Medici had already scattered their legacy across Europe, woven into bloodlines, institutions, and the very language of modern power. Their story did not conclude. It simply became harder to see. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany passed to the Habsburg-Lorraine family, who inherited not only Medici lands and palaces, but also their habits, the quiet fusion of wealth, politics, and patronage. Through marriages made centuries earlier, Medici blood mingled with that of nearly every European royal house. Queens and emperors carried their lineage without even realizing it. The banking ledgers had closed, but their genes, their methods, and their worldview remained alive in the courts of Vienna, Paris, Madrid, and London. Their financial innovations endured too. The double-entry bookkeeping they refined became the grammar of modern capitalism. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, and holding companies, concepts born in the Medici counting houses, form the architecture of global banking. Every balance sheet, every financial institution tracing its ancestry to Renaissance Italy, carries a fragment of Medici invention. When a multinational moves capital across borders, when a banker speculates on currencies, when a state borrows to wage war, it all echoes the mechanisms first tested in Florence. Their cultural legacy is even more visible. The Uffizi Gallery, once the family's administrative center, now holds humanity's greatest art collection. The Laurentian Library still guards manuscripts gathered under their patronage. Tourists wandering through Florence today walk streets designed, funded, or commissioned by Medici hands. Their aesthetic, the classical harmony of proportion, symmetry, and light, became the standard by which Western beauty is judged. Through art, they taught the world how power should look. Even now, the Medici name quietly generates wealth. Every guidebook, every museum ticket, every photograph of Brunelleschi's dome pays tribute to an empire of taste that outlived the family itself. Their investment in culture became a machine that still prints value centuries later. And beyond buildings and books, their idea endures, that wealth can be alchemized into legitimacy, that capital can rewrite lineage. This belief that money is not just power but destiny is the true Medici inheritance. Today's elite follow the same blueprint. Billionaires endow universities and fund museums. Financiers marry into political dynasties. Foundations shape culture under the guise of charity. The methods are modern, but the logic is ancient. The Medici no longer rule Tuscany, but the world they imagined has become our world. A place where money buys narrative, where culture grants absolution, where dynasties extend their reach not through conquest but through continuity. The Medici ended centuries ago, but the world they built, where money buys legitimacy, where culture serves power, where dynasties span continents, that world is still here. And like the family that conceived it, It wears a mask of respectability, hiding its crown in plain sight. They didn't just lend money. They bought the mines that produced the silver that became the money. And once you control the source, you control everything downstream. In the late 15th century, when Europe's thrones were built on borrowed coin, one merchant looked beyond interest rates and repayment schedules. Jacob Fugger of Augsburg, later called the Rich, saw the limits of traditional banking. Lending was fragile. Kings died, wars failed, debts vanished in smoke. Interest rates were hemmed in by church law. Yet kingdoms always needed silver, silver for coins, for soldiers, for the illusion of stability. Fugger began to wonder, what if, instead of lending to those who used money, he could own the places where money began? When emperors came begging, Fugger listened with the calm of a man who already knew the outcome. His terms were simple but profound. If the crown could not repay in coin, it could repay in substance. Mining rights, not promises. Control of production, not paper obligations. The Tyrolean mountains, glittering with veins of silver, became his collateral. In Hungary, the copper mines that supplied Europe's foundries passed into his hands when kings defaulted. Even the Spanish monarchy, dazzled by its New World dreams, turned to Fugger for advances that would fuel its distant conquests. Each failure to repay expanded his dominion underground. The brilliance of this scheme lay in its permanence. A loan ended when it was repaid or lost. A mine, however, kept breathing. It yielded silver day after day, generation after generation. While other bankers counted coins, Fugger owned the earth that minted them. His ledgers recorded not only transactions but extraction, the pulse of production that outlasted contracts and kings alike. Control over Europe's metals meant control over its money supply. By slowing shipments from his mines, Fugger could make silver scarce, raising prices and tightening the flow of coin. When it suited him, he flooded markets, driving inflation that unsettled rivals and indebted monarchs alike. Few realized that one family's decisions beneath the mountains of Tyrol could ripple through every market square in Europe. Rulers feared him, though they rarely admitted it. His vaults supplied their wars. His patience sustained their courts. Yet they resented needing him, resented that a merchant could command more power than the men who wore crowns. Still, they signed his contracts, stamped his seals, and smiled for the portraits he financed. Unlike gold, which merely sat and gleamed, silver and copper worked. They were transformed into coin, cannon, and cable. Fugger's wealth wasn't idle, it was kinetic, circulating through the veins of Europe's economies. His mines were factories of power, their tunnels echoing with the sound of hammers shaping empires. Other bankers speculated. The Fuggers constructed an empire of production, where money itself was mined. Their wealth didn't depend on faith or favor, but on the unceasing rhythm of pickaxes striking stone. And with every strike, Europe tilted a little more toward Augsburg, toward the man who owned the source of its silver dreams. When Jacob Fugger wrote to Emperor Charles V, he didn't use titles or flattery. He simply reminded him, "You wouldn't be emperor without me." And Charles knew it was true. In 1519, the Holy Roman Empire stood at a crossroads. Emperor Maximilian was dead, and Europe's most powerful men gathered to choose his successor. 7 prince-electors held the keys to the crown men, whose loyalty could be bought more easily than earned. 2 rivals vied for their favor: Francis I of France, young and bold, and Charles of Habsburg, heir to Spain, the Netherlands, and Austria, but perilously short of cash. To win, Charles needed not just support, but silver oceans of it. So he turned to the only man in Europe who could summon that kind of wealth without a king's treasury: Jacob Fugger. The banker understood what was at stake. Whoever became emperor would owe him not just repayment, but gratitude that could last generations. It was an investment in power itself. Fugger provided over 500,000 florins, an unimaginable sum, enough to buy cities or armies, but it wasn't handed over in grand gestures. Couriers carried chests of coin to each elector, discreetly, systematically, each payment disguised as a loan or gift. The electors, their consciences soothed by paperwork, voted as planned. When the votes were counted, Charles emerged victorious. The empire was his, and so, in a quieter way, was Fugger's. Charles ascended to the highest throne in Christendom under the shadow of a debt so vast that no tax or tithe could erase it. The empire's crown, the symbol of divine order, had been purchased like any commodity, and everyone knew who had financed the transaction. Fugger never flaunted it. He didn't need to. Power came to him naturally. Monopolies on trade routes, exemptions from laws that bound lesser merchants, noble titles for his descendants. Even kings deferred to his letters. He became not just a banker, but a silent architect of imperial policy. When Charles considered war, Fugger's opinion mattered as much as his generals'. When he weighed treaties, the banker's gold determined their feasibility. Repayment took many forms. The Fuggers were granted mining rights in Spain's colonies, shares in the wealth of the New World, and control of estates across the empire. The silver of Potosi and the copper of Hungary flowed into their accounts. It was a new kind of partnership, the sword and the ledger, each depending on the other. But beneath the glitter of success was something more unsettling. The Holy Roman Empire, supposedly ordained by God, had been bought with borrowed money. The ancient line between divine right and human commerce had blurred. Behind every crown, there now stood a creditor. Charles knew it, and so did Fugger. Their relationship became the blueprint for a new world order, one where financial power could manufacture legitimacy itself. Empires no longer rose solely through conquest or inheritance. They could be purchased, underwritten, and managed like enterprises. Jacob Fugger had proved something astonishing. Money could create monarchs, and for a time the richest man in Europe quietly ruled behind the throne, not with armies but with arithmetic. Martin Luther didn't just challenge the church, he named names, and among them was the most powerful banker in Christendom. When Luther's fiery words spread across Europe in 1517, denouncing indulgences and corruption, his quarrel wasn't only with Rome, it was with the system that funded it. The Fuggers had financed the sale of indulgences that paid for St. Peter's Basilica, turning sin into a business transaction. To Luther, it was the perfect symbol of spiritual decay. To the Fuggers, it was simply commerce. But the monk's hammer struck closer than they expected. In pamphlets and sermons, he accused them of greed so vast it defied Christian conscience. "They suck the blood of the poor," he wrote, and the name Fugger became shorthand for avarice. Across Germany, crowds began whispering that no king or bishop was as rich as the merchant from Augsburg. That was dangerous talk, in a time when faith could ignite rebellion. The family faced a dilemma. Protestant regions were growing wealthier, their markets more dynamic, their rulers eager to break from Catholic constraints on lending. Temptation beckoned. Better profits, fewer restrictions. But the Fuggers understood that their fortunes were woven into the fabric of Catholic power. Their mines, their privileges, their monopolies, all granted by popes and emperors who expected loyalty. To betray that alliance might mean losing everything, so they chose their side. The Fuggers became pillars of Catholic resistance. They financed Habsburg campaigns against Protestant princes, paid for Jesuit schools and churches, and even underwrote the Council of Trent, where bishops gathered to fortify the church's doctrines against reform. While other merchants hedged their bets, Fugger gold funded faith itself. It was not without cost. Protestant cities expelled their agents. Trade networks fractured. Accusations multiplied that they were enemies of reform and allies of oppression. Yet in Catholic realms, their loyalty was rewarded. Monarchs trusted them as defenders of the old order. They gained monopolies others could not, influence others feared to seek. Still, the world was changing. In Protestant lands, new banks rose with new ethics, leaner, freer, more modern. They lent without guilt, invested without confession. The Fuggers, for all their wealth, seemed anchored to an age that was passing. Their faith gave them protection but also chains. As the Reformation spread, the family's name began to fade from the roar of history, overshadowed by the forces it had tried to contain. Yet even in decline, they held their dignity, convinced that service to church and emperor mattered more than fleeting gain. Luther had tried to strip wealth of its holiness. The Fuggers tried to sanctify wealth itself. And between those two visions, Europe tore itself apart. Their choice to remain faithful when profit pointed elsewhere was both their triumph and their undoing. For the first time, Jacob Fugger's legacy met a test that gold alone could not pass. By 1600, the Fuggers were no longer the richest family in Europe, but they were counts, lords, and nobles with estates and titles. Had they failed, or simply won a different game? Their decline began quietly, almost invisibly, the way great empires always fall not with a single catastrophe, but with the slow erosion of advantage. In 1557, Spain, the jewel of their partnerships, declared bankruptcy. The crown that had once promised endless silver now offered only apologies. Millions in debts became worthless ink on paper. The Fuggers, who had financed emperors and kings, learned a bitter truth. Even sovereigns could default. Meanwhile, the world was shifting. Wealth was no longer mined from European hills but carried across oceans. The center of gravity moved westward to the Atlantic, to Amsterdam, to London. There, new kinds of institutions were emerging. Joint stock companies, public banks, trading exchanges. They didn't depend on family loyalty or noble favor. They turned finance into a system, not a dynasty. The age of the merchant prince was ending. The Fuggers faced another enemy time itself. Jacob Fugger's genius had not been inherited in full. Later generations preferred salons to mines, marriages to monarchs over negotiations with them. The family divided into branches, each guarding its share of wealth, each losing a little more initiative. Their mines were sold to cover debts. Their banking network, once the nervous system of Europe, grew thin and provincial. But the transformation was deliberate as much as accidental. Having climbed higher than any merchant before them, the Fuggers sought permanence, not profit. They purchased titles, built palaces, and joined the nobility. The family that once moved emperors now dined beside them. Their gold had turned into heraldry. Their ambition had changed its form. Still, their shadow lingered. Every modern corporation that acquires failing assets, every investor who trades debt for ownership, every state that borrows from private capital, all echo Fugger's logic. Control the resource, not the transaction. Finance the throne, and the throne becomes your partner. Their story became a template and a warning. Dynastic power could conquer markets, but it could not conquer evolution. Systems replace families, institutions outlive their founders, and the restless energy that once drove fortunes turns, in time, to caution and ceremony. Yet perhaps that was Jacob Fugger's final victory. The merchant who mastered emperors ensured his descendants would never need to bargain again. They had exchanged risk for respectability, fortune for lineage. In the end, the Fuggers didn't fall, they ossified. They became part of the structure they once controlled. Venice had no king, no emperor, no pope. It had something more powerful, a council of families who understood that wealth shared strategically lasts longer than wealth hoarded individually. The story of Venice begins not with conquest, but with retreat. When barbarian tribes swept across Italy after the fall of Rome, refugees fled into the shallow lagoons of the Adriatic, building makeshift homes on islands of mud and salt. They had no farmland, no fortresses, no armies. What they had was water shifting, protective, and full of possibilities. From that unstable foundation, they built one of the most enduring powers in history. Necessity shaped their genius. With no fertile soil or mineral wealth, survival depended on the sea. The Venetians became traders, shipbuilders, and navigators. Salt, the first commodity they mastered, paid for their defenses and funded their expansion. Gradually, their fleets reached farther, to Constantinople, Alexandria, and the coasts of Flanders. Each voyage brought back not just goods, but information, currents, markets, alliances. Venice learned that power was not only about possession, but about connection. Unlike the kingdoms of Europe ruled by monarchs and nobles, Venice grew into something different, a republic of merchants. In 1297, the Serrata del Maggior Consiglio, the closing of the Great Council, turned this fluid society into a stable oligarchy. Membership in the ruling council was restricted to a fixed list of families, creating a closed circle of power. But these were not idle aristocrats. They were businessmen whose fortunes depended on the success of their ships and the stability of their markets. In Venice, commerce was politics. The same men who negotiated grain prices in Cairo debated naval policy in the Doge's palace. Offices rotated among families, ensuring that no single house dominated for long. The state itself became a partnership, each family a shareholder, each decision a matter of calculation. Even the Doge, the symbolic head of the republic, was more chairman than monarch, bound by councils, committees, and balance sheets. This system produced something rare in medieval Europe: stability. While kingdoms rose and fell, Venice endured. It survived wars, plagues, and the shifting tides of empire, because no single man's ambition could bring it down. Its policies were pragmatic, its morality fluid. Venice traded with Muslims during crusades, supplied ships to rival powers, and made peace when others sought glory because profit mattered more than pride. Over centuries, this blend of commerce and governance created a city unlike any other, half state, half corporation, its marble palaces financed by trade winds and its politics guided by ledgers. Venice proved that an empire could be run not by warriors or priests, but by merchants who understood that the surest defense of a city is the prosperity of its people. While other powers relied on spies, Venice made espionage a civic duty. Every merchant was an intelligence gatherer. Every trade mission was a reconnaissance operation. To outsiders, the city shimmered with trade, its quays crowded with silk and spice, its harbors echoing with the clatter of crates and chains. But beneath that surface pulsed something quieter and far more potent: information. The Republic's power didn't come only from its fleets or its gold. It came from knowing things before anyone else did. Venetian merchants were scattered across the known world, from London to Constantinople, from the ports of Alexandria to the bazaars of Damascus. Each trading post was both market and observation tower. Reports flowed back to the lagoon: whispers of war, rumors of famine, shifts in alliances, movements of ships. Knowledge was the cargo that mattered most, and Venice made it mandatory. Merchants returning home were required to brief the Council of Ten, the Republic's secretive intelligence body, on everything they had learned abroad. The Council of Ten became the silent heart of Venice. It met behind closed doors in chambers lined with velvet and guarded by armed men. Its records were locked away, its deliberations hidden even from the Senate. The council directed spies, managed informants, and sanctioned quiet eliminations of those who threatened the state. Its reach extended from the Doge's palace to the streets of distant cities. Venetian intelligence worked through structure, not chaos. Reports were written in code, sent through trusted couriers who followed fixed maritime schedules. The Republic perfected a communication system faster and safer than any rival. Letters carried across the Adriatic were sometimes copied 3 times by separate ships, ensuring that no single disaster could interrupt the flow of information. Venetian cryptographers developed ciphers that baffled foreign courts. Their cartographers drew maps so precise that generals secretly copied them for their own campaigns. Information wasn't just used for defense. It was a weapon of trade. Knowing that a war was about to begin meant predicting which ports would close and which goods would surge in value. When rumors of Ottoman invasion reached Venice weeks before the rest of Europe, merchants quietly bought up grain and timber, then sold it back to desperate kingdoms at triple the price. Knowledge became profit. Secrecy became policy. Even the church wasn't safe from their reach. Venetian informants infiltrated the Vatican, reporting the politics of papal elections and the debts of cardinals. The Council of Ten kept dossiers on kings, bishops, and generals' records of who owed whom, who could be bribed, who could be broken. But the same vigilance that protected the Republic also turned inward. Nobles spied on nobles. Letters were intercepted. Servants were questioned in secret. It was said that in Venice, walls had ears and canals carried whispers. Paranoia became a civic habit. Yet this ever-watchful system ensured that no single family could rise above the others. Balance was maintained by mutual fear. Venice's greatness didn't rest solely on its ships or silver, but on its invisible network, a web of minds and messages stretched across continents. Long before the age of telegraphs and satellites, Venice proved that information could be the most valuable empire of all. They realized that the biggest fortune wasn't in trading goods, but in inventing the systems that made trading possible. Control the infrastructure, control everything. For most of medieval Europe, trade was a gamble, a fragile hope lashed to the fate of wind and wave. A single storm could erase a fortune. A single dishonest partner could undo a generation's work. But in Venice, uncertainty became an invitation. The city turned risk itself into a commodity, something that could be measured, priced, and shared. It began with the sea. Venetian merchants knew that every voyage carried danger, so they invented a way to tame it: maritime insurance. Investors paid a premium to cover potential losses. If the ship sank, the insurer paid. If it returned, the profit was shared. For the first time, disaster could be accounted for, transformed from fate into mathematics. That shift turning chaos into calculation was the beginning of modern finance. Then came the commenda, a simple idea, yet revolutionary. One man provided the capital, another the labor. The investor stayed home. The trader braved the voyage. Profits were split by contract, losses shared by design. Wealth no longer needed courage, only foresight. Old merchants, too frail to sail, became financiers. Young captains became entrepreneurs. The economy multiplied as capital found new hands to move it. Venice also solved another ancient problem: the peril of moving money across a dangerous world. They created bills of exchange paper promises that replaced heavy gold. A merchant in Venice could pay another in London with a document, not a chest of coins. Trust became transferable. Wealth could now flow as ink, not metal. And from that flowed everything else: credit, debt, and the idea that value could exist without being seen. Behind all of it was precision. Venetian accountants refined double-entry bookkeeping, the quiet revolution that made empires possible. Every debit had its credit, every gain its shadow. It was not just a system, it was a worldview. Balance as virtue, accuracy as power. In the marble offices along the Grand Canal, ledgers became sacred texts. Trade was no longer the art of risk, it became the science of structure. Venice taught Europe that prosperity could be engineered, not merely hoped for. Ships carried spices, but the true exports were ideas, insurance, contracts, credit, all designed to make commerce predictable. These methods spread, copied and adapted by Florentine bankers, Dutch traders, and English financiers. But they all began in the lagoons, with merchants who turned the perils of the sea into the architecture of capitalism. Venice had built something more durable than fleets or fortresses. It built the grammar of money itself, a language the world still speaks. Venice fell. But the idea of Venice that merchants could collectively control states, that networks could outlast kingdoms, that idea conquered the world. When Napoleon's troops entered the lagoon in 1797, the republic that had endured for 1,000 years surrendered without a fight. Its banners came down, its councils dissolved, its secrets scattered. Yet the fall of the city was not the fall of its system. The families that once ruled the Great Council dispersed across Europe, carrying with them the habits and methods of a civilization built on information, discipline, and mutual interest. Unlike the Medici or the Fuggers, no single Venetian dynasty became legend. That anonymity was intentional. The Republic had designed itself to prevent dominance, to keep power distributed among many hands. The Mocenigo family gave the city 7 doges. The Contarini produced diplomats and financiers. Dozens of other houses shared authority so evenly that none could topple the rest. When the state died, the network survived. Those same principles quietly resurfaced wherever commerce met governance. In Amsterdam, merchant oligarchies founded the Dutch East India Company, a public-private empire where state and capital blurred as they had in Venice. In London, the city corporation preserved an ancient autonomy, ruled not by monarchs but by merchants, with votes still weighted toward wealth. In Switzerland, banking families built a fortress of discretion, bound by trust, secrecy, and collective interest, echoes of Venetian prudence behind mountain walls. Venice's true heirs were not its descendants, but its imitators. Its model distributed power sustained by shared profit became the blueprint for corporate capitalism. Modern boards of directors, multinational partnerships, and financial consortia all follow Venetian logic. No single ruler, but a self-regulating network. The revolving door between government and industry, where policymakers become financiers and financiers become policymakers, is the same pattern that once filled the Doge's palace. Even the intelligence culture that Venice perfected lives on in subtler forms. The obsession with data, the surveillance of markets, the pursuit of advanced knowledge, all mirror the Republic's creed that whoever knows first rules longest. Information remains the new sea upon which empires sail. Venice proved that stability doesn't require a single strongman. It requires a structure of interlocking interests so balanced that betrayal becomes irrational. Monarchies crumble with their kings. Networks endure because they replace individuals without losing continuity. Today, global finance resembles the lagoon more than the throne room. Power flows, diffuses, and reforms itself. No single hand directs it, yet it moves with collective purpose. The Venetian experiment, commerce as government, secrecy as protection, cooperation as control, has become the architecture of the modern world. Venice vanished as a city-state, but its reflection glimmers everywhere. In the glass towers of financial capitals, in the anonymous alliances of capital, in the quiet confidence of those who rule not by decree, but by coordination. And perhaps that is the final paradox. The city of water drowned, but its system fluid, adaptable, and invisible never sank. They called them nephews. Everyone knew they were sons. The church pretended to be celibate. The Pope's family became rich, and everyone understood the transaction. For centuries, the papacy was the most coveted throne in Europe, not for its spiritual rewards, but for the vast machinery of wealth and influence it controlled. The Catholic Church owned a third of the land in some regions, collected tithes from millions, and could crown or destroy kings with a word. To capture the papacy was to gain command of a global empire, one that taxed not subjects, but souls. And so, Rome became a game board where a few dozen Italian families played for divine stakes. The goal was not salvation, it was succession. To make one of their own, Pope meant opening the gates to a treasure house disguised as a temple. Once elected, a pope's first act was rarely prayer. It was appointment. Relatives were elevated to cardinals overnight, officially nephews. In a fiction everyone politely maintained. They were given bishoprics rich with income, governorships of papal lands, monopolies on salt and grain. A papacy might last only a decade, but in that time a clever family could extract wealth enough to sustain itself for centuries. The word nepotism was born here, from the Latin nepos, nephew. It became the code of papal politics. Calixtus III of the Borgia family made two of his nephews cardinals within a year of his election. Paul III of the Farnese family created his teenage grandsons cardinals before they'd learned theology. Urban VIII of the Barberini family siphoned so much papal revenue to his relatives that his successors nearly bankrupted the Vatican, chasing it back. The system was elegant in its cynicism. A pope's reign was temporary. The family's fortunes needed to be permanent. Palaces were built not as papal residences, but as dynastic estates, paid for by church coffers yet privately owned. Church offices were sold, benefices distributed, and contracts for building cathedrals conveniently awarded to family firms. The papacy was a divine franchise rotating among families, each enriching itself before the next took the chair. Beneath the marble and incense, Rome operated like a family syndicate. Cardinals elected popes they expected would die soon, opening opportunities for others. Younger relatives were placed in lucrative positions to ensure continuity. Each papacy was both a spiritual rain and a financial harvest. In this way, holiness became hereditary. Religious authority was converted, quietly and efficiently, into real estate, art, and noble titles. The families of Rome, Borgia, Farnese, Barberini, Borghese turned the promise of heaven into dynastic wealth that endured on earth. The church preached sacrifice. Its rulers practiced inheritance. And for generations, the faith of millions flowed upward, transformed into palaces, fortunes, and bloodlines that still linger in the Roman air. The Borgias weren't the most corrupt papal family. They were just the most honest about it. While others whispered about divine providence, the Borgias talked about poison and conquest. In 1492, the year Columbus sailed west, Rodrigo Borgia bought himself the papacy. The election of Alexander VI was an open auction, bags of gold changing hands in the corridors of the Vatican, cardinals quietly counting bribes while pretending to pray. It shocked Europe, but in Rome, no one blinked. Everyone knew that salvation cost money. The only question was how much. Alexander VI understood power not as mystery, but as machinery. He dispensed blessings and bishoprics the way merchants distributed shares, strategically, profitably, with careful attention to loyalty. His family became his cabinet, his army, his instrument. He did not hide his children, as other popes did. He acknowledged them proudly. Cesare, his brilliant and dangerous son, and Lucrezia, his golden-haired daughter, whose marriages became treaties in silk. At 18, Cesare was made cardinal, not because of holiness, but because of blood. When his father needed generals, not clerics, Cesare shed his robes, traded the crucifix for a sword, and set out to carve a kingdom from the center of Italy. He moved through the Romagna like a shadow, swift, calculating, merciless. Cities fell before him, not through siege but through betrayal. Enemies invited to reconcile over dinner never saw dawn. Lucrezia played a different role. Married 3 times, each union a political maneuver, she was both pawn and diplomat. Her beauty and intelligence became the family's soft weapon, opening doors that armies could not. Rumors clung to her incest, poison, manipulation, but in truth she was what her world demanded, adaptable, loyal, and aware that survival required performance. The Borgias' ambition was simple yet staggering, to turn the papacy into a hereditary monarchy. The Church's power, fused with secular control of central Italy, could have created a dynasty rivaling Spain or France. And for a moment, it nearly happened. Cesare's forces conquered most of the papal states. Alexander's coffers overflowed. Their enemies either died or married into alliance. But the wheel of fortune turned faster than even the Borgias could manipulate. In 1503, Alexander fell ill, some said poisoned by his own concoction, others by fate. Cesare, stricken at the same time, lost his strength, and with it his army. Within weeks, their empire of intrigue collapsed. Rivals struck back, allies deserted. Cesare fled, captured, and eventually killed in exile. Lucrezia retreated to Ferrara, where she became a patron of art and piety, as if to rewrite her family's story in softer ink. The Borgias' fall was swift, almost theatrical, fitting for a family that had turned religion into drama. They left behind no kingdom, no enduring line of rulers. What survived was a legend, a name that became synonymous with corruption and ambition. Yet their sin was not unique. Only their boldness was. Other papal families stole in whispers. The Borgias stole in daylight and signed their names on the deeds. While the Borgias grabbed for kingdoms and died forgotten, the Farnese built quietly. Their palace still stands. Their art still draws crowds. Their descendants still matter. Their story began, fittingly, in the shadow of scandal. Giulia Farnese, renowned for her beauty, became the mistress of Pope Alexander VI, the infamous Rodrigo Borgia. Rome whispered her name with both envy and outrage, calling her Giulia la Bella. But while gossip circled her bed, her brother Alessandro was watching the altar. With his sister beside the Pope, his fortunes began to rise. Within a few years, he was a cardinal. Alessandro Farnese learned from the Borgias' mistakes. He saw that power seized too quickly collapses under its own weight. Instead, he waited. For nearly 30 years, he maneuvered within the Vatican's labyrinth, cultivating allies, surviving rival factions, and building a reputation for moderation. By the time he was elected Pope Paul III in 1534, he was not the shocking choice but the safe one, the steady hand after decades of corruption and chaos. Yet beneath that calm exterior was a strategist who understood the game perfectly. Paul III revived the ancient art of papal nepotism with quiet precision. His grandsons, barely teenagers, became cardinals, securing lifelong incomes and influence. His son, Pier Luigi, received a duchy carved directly from papal lands. Parma and Piacenza, small but sovereign, hereditary and enduring. In one generation, the Farnese transformed spiritual authority into a secular dynasty. But their method differed from the Borgias. They did not conquer by force. They accumulated by design. The Farnese invested in permanence, land, art, architecture, and alliances. Their palace in Rome, begun under Paul III, was not merely a residence, but a declaration, stone proof of wealth that could not be confiscated when the papacy passed to another family. Its walls housed masterpieces, archives, and generations of power. They understood diversification centuries before financiers gave it a name. Their wealth came not only from papal grants but from agricultural estates, mining rights, trade monopolies, and marriage dowries. Each venture was another thread in a net strong enough to survive the death of any single pope. Even their cultural ambitions served strategy. By patronizing artists, scholars, and architects, the Farnese wrapped themselves in the glow of humanism. Power, cloaked in beauty, became harder to criticize. Visitors to Rome saw not greed but grandeur. When Paul III died, the family remained firmly anchored dukes in Parma, princes of the church, patrons of the arts. Their duchy endured for 2 centuries. Their art became the core of museum collections, and their bloodline intertwined with Europe's nobility. The Farnese proved that patient accumulation could achieve what ambition never could: continuity. They built a legacy immune to scandal, one that outlasted popes, kings, and even the church's reforms. Their lesson was simple, almost mathematical: seize nothing quickly, lose nothing completely, and let time itself compound the family fortune. The popes stopped making their nephews cardinals. But the families those nephews founded, they're still around, still connected, still influential. The Counter-Reformation tried to clean house. The Council of Trent thundered against corruption, demanding purity of faith and discipline among the clergy. Outwardly, it worked. The sale of offices slowed. Scandalous appointments grew rarer. The papacy rewrapped itself in solemn dignity. But beneath the surface, little truly changed. The networks remained. Only the language shifted from favor to service, from kinship to trust. By the 17th century, the great papal dynasties had adapted. They no longer flaunted their privileges, they institutionalized them. The Barberini, whose Pope Urban VIII had nearly emptied the Vatican treasury enriching his kin, emerged from censure as nobles rather than bankers. The Borghese, elevated by Pope Paul V, turned their papal estates into noble holdings and built palaces that still dominate Rome's skyline. The Farnese Duchy endured until the 18th century, its rulers marrying into European courts. The families that once ruled the church through bloodlines began ruling Italy through property. They traded sacred offices for secular titles, bishops' mitres for ducal coronets. Their children sat in parliaments instead of pulpits. Yet their fortunes still glimmered with church gold, accumulated during centuries when piety and profit were indistinguishable. The legacy of nepotism became architectural as much as genealogical. Walk through Rome today, and it is still visible: the Palazzo Farnese, the Palazzo Barberini, the Borghese Gallery, all monuments to families who turned faith into infrastructure. What was once corruption became culture. Tourists now queue to admire ceilings painted with money once meant for the poor. Even as the Vatican reformed, the habit of familial privilege proved indestructible. Contracts, consultancies, and quiet recommendations replaced open patronage. The surnames changed form but not function. Power remained a matter of connection. In the Vatican Bank, in Italian politics, in international diplomacy, one can still trace lines that run backward to those same papal houses. The Church learned to hide its machinery better, but the system itself of favor flowing through trusted circles survived. Its modern descendants live in boardrooms, governments, and foundations. The methods remain timeless: loyalty rewarded with opportunity, scandal managed by secrecy, and power distributed among the well-born and well-connected. In that sense, the papal families succeeded beyond measure. Their papacies ended centuries ago, yet their influence endures in art, in institutions, in the invisible architecture of privilege. The crosses were polished. The bloodlines remained. They didn't marry people. They married portfolios, land, titles, alliances, and genetic potential, all packaged in a wedding contract. In the medieval world, blood was more than inheritance, it was identity. It carried sanctity and status, an invisible currency that determined who could rule, who could marry, and who could never aspire beyond service. To possess good blood was to hold a form of spiritual capital, believed to flow from ancestors as tangibly as property or coin. Families guarded it with the care of bankers, protecting gold. Every great house maintained genealogies like ledgers, tracing not just ancestors but collateral branches, obscure cousins, and forgotten alliances. These records weren't mere pride, they were tools of calculation. Somewhere in those tangled lines might lie a claim to a distant estate, a dormant title, a connection that could be awakened when opportunity came. A marriage was never just a union, it was a merger. Families plotted matches with the precision of generals planning campaigns. Suitors were scouted years in advance. Daughters were betrothed in childhood, not for affection but for position. A promising alliance might be delayed or accelerated, depending on the health of a king or the fertility of a rival. Geography was no obstacle. Letters traveled across mountains and seas, negotiating unions between families in Portugal and Poland, Venice and Vienna. Europe became a web of interlinked ambitions, where every noble house was both ally and competitor. The Catholic Church, guardian of morality, complicated the arithmetic. Its rules against consanguinity, marriage between relatives, threatened to collapse these tight-knit networks. Yet the same church also offered a solution. A papal dispensation could erase the sin of cousin marriage for a fee. Families paid the institution that forbade their unions to bless them, turning morality into revenue. The church condemned incest while quietly financing it. Each marriage was an investment in the future, its dividends often realized generations later. A seemingly modest match might yield unimaginable power when a child's distant cousin died without heirs. The Habsburgs, once provincial German nobles, transformed themselves through one such chain of marriages. Maximilian Ives' union with Mary of Burgundy in 1477 brought the wealthy Burgundian Netherlands into their hands. It was not luck, it was long-term strategy, patiently executed across generations. But these alliances came at a human price. Brides crossed borders they would never return from, entering courts where they spoke no language and trusted no faces. Husbands treated wives as dynastic assets, bound to produce heirs like harvests. Love, when it appeared, was accidental. A barren wife was not pitied, she was replaced. Marriage in this world was less about companionship than continuity. The family was eternal. Individuals were temporary vessels ensuring its survival. Bloodlines became the medieval version of immortality, a living inheritance passed from womb to womb, century after century. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. The Habsburgs turned that proverb into a strategy, and that strategy into an empire. In the beginning, they were minor German counts with modest lands and little glory. Their castles overlooked cold rivers, not capitals, but they possessed one inheritance greater than gold discipline. While other nobles spent fortunes on soldiers, the Habsburgs invested in weddings. Every generation treated the marriage altar as its battlefield. Every vow was a conquest. Their ascent began with a single, audacious match. In 1477, Maximilian I married Mary of Burgundy, heiress to the wealthy Burgundian Netherlands. The union brought them one of Europe's richest territories, Flanders, Brabant, and the thriving cities of the north. Merchants' taxes replaced battlefield plunder. Silks and spices flowed into Habsburg coffers. What began as a marriage became an empire's foundation. The pattern continued. Maximilian's son Philip married Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs of Spain. Through her, the Habsburgs inherited not just the Iberian kingdoms but their new American dominions, where silver bled from the mountains of Potosi. By the early 16th century, Charles V, their grandson, ruled an empire so vast that the sun quite literally never set upon it. And all of it had been won not by armies, but by alliances sealed in cathedrals. Behind the ceremony lay method. The Habsburg court maintained exhaustive genealogical charts mapping every noble house in Europe, tracking deaths, inheritances, and marriages like accountants monitoring markets. Young archdukes and archduchesses were educated not for love, but for leverage. Inheritance laws were studied, manipulated, and occasionally rewritten. If a region permitted female succession, a Habsburg son was offered to its heiress. If it did not, the family waited, patient as spiders, for the male line to die out and then claimed the web. But the perfection of this strategy carried its own flaw. The family grew too closed, too inward. Cousins married cousins to keep the map intact, each union tightening the genetic circle. The consequences accumulated in visibly crooked jaws, fragile children, minds dulled by the repetition of ancestry. By the time of Charles II of Spain, the dynasty's logic had turned against itself. His face bore the famous Habsburg jaw, his body frail, his mind clouded. When he died childless in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, undone not by enemies, but by its own precision. Their triumph had become their curse. The marriages that built an empire also hollowed it. the same blood that united continents eventually thinned beyond recovery. The genetic mathematics of ambition had reached its limit. Yet even in collapse, the Habsburgs had rewritten the meaning of power. They had proven that conquest could come not from swords but signatures, that empires could be engineered through patience rather than violence. Their legacy was not merely an empire, but a formula, a belief that, with enough planning, lineage itself could be weaponized. And for centuries, others tried to copy it, unaware that behind the grandeur of dynastic maps lay the quiet warning of blood turned against itself. They called it the balance of power. But really, it was a family reunion where the cousins occasionally went to war and their uncles negotiated peace at the next wedding. By the 17th century, Europe's ruling class had married itself into a single extended family. The pool of acceptable partners, royal, noble, legitimate, was so small that within a few generations nearly every crowned head shared ancestors. Pedigree replaced geography. Bloodlines crossed borders even when armies did not. A war between kingdoms was often a quarrel between relatives. The mathematics of kinship is merciless. Every generation doubles one's ancestors, but aristocrats drew from the same small circle, folding their trees back on themselves. A duke's daughter in Vienna might be both cousin and niece to a prince in Madrid. An English queen might share grandparents with her French adversary. When Europe's monarchs sent letters across borders, they began not with Your Majesty, but with Dear Cousin. The 20th century would make this literal. During World War I, George V of Britain, Wilhelm II of Germany, and Nicholas II of Russia, all grandchildren of Queen Victoria, led their nations into slaughter, while still addressing each other in affectionate telegrams, signed Georgie, Willie, and Nicky. The cousinhood had turned fratricidal, yet it remained family business. This dense web of relationships did more than blur loyalties. It became infrastructure. Information, favors, and money flowed through marriage lines faster than through formal diplomacy. A princess writing to her sister in another court could pass secrets disguised as gossip. A wedding could seal a trade treaty without ever mentioning tariffs. A christening could double as a political summit. The personal and the geopolitical were inseparable. Not only royals mastered the pattern. Banking dynasties such as the Rothschilds built their own cousinhood, marrying almost exclusively within their extended family to preserve trust and control. With brothers stationed in London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples, they turned marriage into corporate governance. Their letters coded, loyal, and constant linked capitals more effectively than any government courier. Family unity replaced nationality. Within these cousinhoods, self-interest merged with collective survival. Reputation was shared. Betrayal was costly. A scandal in one branch could stain them all. Loyalty became not just moral but mathematical. Every action rippled through the web. Family itself became a mechanism of governance, soft power sustained by lineage. Modern historians using network analysis have charted these interconnections like constellations. The lines reveal something astonishing. The story of Europe was not a struggle between nations, but a negotiation among relatives protecting shared assets. Blood was both bond and boundary. To understand European politics, one must look less at flags and more at family trees. Behind every treaty and war stood cousins calculating inheritance, uncles whispering counsel, and aunts arranging introductions that would change the fate of continents. They called it nobility. In truth, it was an early version of globalization where power, loyalty, and information all traveled through veins. We call it following your heart. But somehow, hearts consistently lead heirs to other heirs, trust fund kids to trust fund kids, and power to power. The faces have changed, the rituals softened, but the logic endures. Marriage remains the quiet mechanism by which elites preserve themselves. Where castles once guarded lineages, now exclusive schools, private clubs, and gated communities perform the same function: walls of culture and access, keeping the circle small. Modern matchmaking begins early. Children of influence grow up together in the same classrooms at Eton, Phillips Exeter, or Lycée Louis le Grand. They attend the same universities, ski the same resorts, intern at each other's firms. By the time they fall in love, their unions have already been pre-vetted by generations of social engineering. The courtship appears spontaneous. The structure beneath it is ancient. Old titles still attract new fortunes. A tech billionaire's child marries into faded European nobility, buying centuries of legitimacy for the price of a ceremony. Aristocratic families, once struggling to maintain estates, welcome the infusion of liquidity. Each side gains what the other lacks: capital for the old, credibility for the new. The exchange is as precise as any medieval dowry. The aesthetics, however, have evolved. Where once a bishop officiated, now a celebrity designer coordinates. The settings, palaces, vineyards, art museums remain the same. Beneath vows of passion lies the same calculation: merging resources, consolidating networks, reinforcing class identity. Even outside royalty, the patterns repeat. Political dynasties intertwine through marriage. The Kennedys, Bushes, and Clintons, tied by shared godparents, alliances, and friendships that blur into kinship. Finance families crossbreed with industrial and media dynasties, creating webs of influence that extend across boardrooms and continents. The surnames differ from the past, but the continuity is unmistakable. Sociologists now map this phenomenon with new tools. Data shows assortative mating, people marrying within their income bracket or educational tier, has risen sharply. Elite families marry other elites at higher rates than in the 19th century. The mechanism is no longer arranged by parents, but by proximity. Algorithms, schools, and professions quietly doing the work that once fell to heralds and matchmakers. Romance provides the story. Structure provides the outcome. Love may light the fuse, but wealth decides where it burns. Each generation recreates its version of the dynastic marriage, calling it coincidence, compatibility, or fate. Yet the results are the same. Power circulates among those already near it, ensuring that the old aristocracy never truly vanished. It simply rebranded. The medieval language of lineage has faded, but the game continues. The rings are smaller now, the titles quieter. Still, in boardrooms and ballrooms alike, bloodlines remain the currency that never loses value. The most powerful families you've never heard of stayed that way because they understood. Fame is for performers. Invisibility is for power. History remembers kings and generals, the ones who stood in sunlight, who wore crowns, who marched before crowds. But the families who funded them, who whispered in their ears, who turned war and peace into profitable seasons, those names fade into the shadows by design. Their anonymity wasn't neglect, it was strategy. Visibility invites envy. Fame attracts scrutiny. But silence moves undisturbed. These dynasties learned early that to endure, one must appear modest even when controlling empires. Their wealth passed through proxies and intermediaries, their names absent from contracts that could one day be used against them. They funded monarchs through shell alliances, traded through front companies centuries before the term existed, and allowed kings to take the credit for victories their money purchased. Invisibility was armor. Public power could be confiscated. Private influence could not. When popes fell or monarchs were overthrown, the quiet families simply shifted allegiance, continuing their work behind new banners. They let others wear the crowns, then collected the interest. They also mastered the art of historical self-erasure. Chronicles praised royal valor and divine providence, not merchant financing or dowry negotiations. The great families funded the writers, the artists, the architects of memory, and instructed them to look elsewhere. The story of Europe became a stage play of kings, while the financiers wrote the script unseen. Their restraint extended to daily life. Where nobles flaunted jewels, these families wore discretion. Their houses were elegant but unpretentious. Their wealth flowed in ledgers, not chandeliers. When revolutions came, the extravagant fell, first the ones whose palaces screamed privilege. The discreet survived, quietly relocating wealth, reinventing names, waiting for the fever to pass. During the French Revolution, those who had courted titles were dragged to guillotines. Those who had courted silence reopened their counting houses under new governments. During the Reformation, the loud believers burned, while those who traded both sides' debts prospered. Flexibility followed invisibility. Even now, the pattern persists. The world's quietest billionaires operate through private trusts, discreet holdings, and family offices unknown to search engines. Their companies hold companies that hold companies. Their faces never appear in magazines. Their voices never in interviews. They understand the old rule. Once you are seen, you can be targeted. To vanish from history's spotlight is not to lose power, but to keep it indefinitely. The visible must perform. The invisible can endure. They knew the hard part wasn't making a fortune. It was raising children who wouldn't waste it. So they built machines to turn heirs into worthy successors. In every age, dynasties face the same dilemma. Wealth is a magnet for decay. The first generation builds, the second preserves, the third forgets. The cycle is as old as inheritance itself. But the families that endured understood this law and refused to obey it. They designed systems to train heirs as carefully as they managed ships or mines. Childhood in such houses was not leisure, it was apprenticeship. From the moment they could hold a pen, heirs learned ledgers, correspondence, and the language of negotiation. Tutors taught them Latin and mathematics, but also discretion, the art of appearing ordinary while understanding everything. Playtime often took place in counting rooms, surrounded by parchment and silence. The Medici perfected this method. Young family members were sent abroad to manage far-flung branches of the bank, apprenticed to uncles and cousins who tested their judgment under pressure. It was both opportunity and examination. Those who thrived earned greater trust. Those who failed were quietly sidelined. The Rothschilds later refined the pattern. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 1 network. Each son learned to operate independently, but the family communicated daily through letters coded with private phrases only they could decipher. Their education wasn't about personal success, it was about cohesion. Marriage was another form of training. Spouses were selected not only for pedigree but for competence and temperament. A clever partner could steady an unstable heir. A shrewd alliance could correct a weak branch of the family tree. Marriage contracts were written like corporate charters, detailing what could be sold, spent, or inherited, ensuring no impulsive romance could dissolve the foundation. Control extended beyond emotion to economics. Fortunes were locked into trusts, preventing heirs from liquidating core assets. Family councils oversaw major decisions collectively, turning governance into ritual. A young heir might sign documents, but never alone. Authority was earned in increments, tested and watched. And when an heir proved unfit, there were ways to contain the damage. Some were nudged toward the church, others toward harmless diplomacy. Sometimes the family's public loyalty to primogeniture, eldest inherits all, was quietly bent. A more capable younger sibling might assume control in practice, while the eldest enjoyed ceremonial dignity. The family's survival mattered more than fairness. Such discipline created tension. Brothers competed, cousins maneuvered, yet all were bound by a single truth. Their fortune existed only because they acted as one. Personal ambition was tolerated. Family fragmentation was not. These dynasties discovered what kingdoms never could. Succession could be engineered. Kings had no choice but to accept the child born next. Families did. Through structure, surveillance, and shared interest, they built a system that converted inheritance from a gamble into an institution. Each new generation was a test of continuity, and those who passed it didn't just inherit wealth, they inherited the machinery to preserve it. They put eggs in every basket they could find, then invented new baskets. Because when you can't predict the future, you prepare for all of them. Every family that lasted more than a generation learned one brutal lesson. Concentration is fatal. A single monarch's default, a single shipwreck, a single failed crop, each could erase decades of fortune. So they learned to scatter risk like seeds on the wind. Diversification was more than finance. It was survival philosophy. If one branch fell, another would rise. If one city burned, another would thrive. Families didn't live in places, they occupied networks. The Rothschilds were the model perfected. 5 brothers in 5 capitals: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples, bound by coded letters and mutual trust. Each brother managed his city's fortunes, yet the wealth flowed through all, protected by distance and secrecy. When revolutions erupted, one branch lost offices while another gained new clients. No single war or ruler could strike them all at once. Earlier dynasties had practiced the same logic in simpler form. The Medici invested in cloth, mining, and banking. When the papal markets soured, their Florentine trade sustained them. Venetian families traded spices and metals while buying land in the countryside, ensuring that when commerce faltered, fields still produced rent. The great banking houses owned palaces for prestige, vineyards for continuity, and ships for risk. Each asset had its rhythm: land for slow, steady income, trade for quick profit, government loans for influence, art for immortality. They diversified across time as well as sectors. A portfolio might include short-term speculation, medium-term loans, and long-term investments in marriages and education. A warehouse might burn, but a son at court could open a new market. They learned to think generationally, balancing patience with agility, permanence with movement. Politics, too, required diversification. Families rarely tied themselves to a single faith or regime. One cousin might serve a Catholic monarch, another a Protestant court. One brother lent to a republic, another to its rivals. They called it prudence. Their enemies called it treachery. But history rewarded the survivors, not the loyal. Legal ingenuity added another layer of protection. Assets were divided among separate entities, trusts, companies, estates, so that no ruler or creditor could seize everything at once. Citizenship itself became negotiable. A banker might hold papers from 3 kingdoms, choosing identity as strategically as investment. To outsiders, it looked like cunning. To them, it was geometry spreading weight until no single point could break. This structure gave them something priceless: resilience. While empires fell and ideology shifted, diversified families remained, reshaping themselves to whatever age replaced the last. They didn't predict the future. They designed for it. In a world where news traveled at horse speed, the family with the fastest horses didn't just get information first. They shaped reality for everyone else. Power once belonged to those who owned land or armies. But the clever families realized there was a subtler empire to command, one built from letters, whispers, and the time gap between knowing and not knowing. In that gap lay profit, and sometimes history itself. Centuries before the term intelligence network existed, merchant dynasties had already built one. Couriers rode between their counting houses, carrying sealed packets wrapped in silk. Agents stationed in every major port sent reports on crop failures, war rumors, and shifts in royal favor. They wrote in code and cipher, sometimes invisible ink, so a captured letter revealed nothing. Their systems outpaced kings. Governments waited weeks for news their bankers already knew. The Venetians perfected it first. Their merchants reported not just prices but politics, feeding the Republic's secret councils with data that shaped policy and profit. Later, the Rothschilds transformed that model into science. They maintained private couriers, carrier pigeons, and coded correspondence that reached London days before official dispatches. When Napoleon fell at Waterloo, their London office knew before Parliament. They quietly bought British bonds while panic gripped the market, then sold them after the victory was confirmed. Information became alchemy, turning rumor into gold. But intelligence wasn't only for markets. It guided diplomacy, business, and even survival. Knowing which city would revolt, which monarch was dying, or which tax decree was being drafted meant being able to act before the world caught up. Families that could anticipate the next shift were never trapped by it. They weaponized ignorance. Sometimes they shared information, selectively feeding fragments to rulers or rivals, shaping their decisions without revealing the whole picture. In negotiations, they always seemed unreasonably lucky, as if fate favored their judgment. In truth, it was simply data arriving earlier. Over time, they built institutions around this advantage. Archives thicker than any government's, correspondence stretching back generations. They weren't just recording history, they were tracking probability. Each new message became a thread in an invisible web connecting ports, palaces, and markets. The loop was self-reinforcing. Better intelligence produced more wealth. More wealth funded faster couriers, better informants, stronger encryption. While others reacted, these families predicted. Even now, the logic survives. Modern heirs don't send riders. They build networks of analysts, algorithms, and private briefings. The couriers became databases. The ciphers became encryption keys. Yet the principle is the same. Whoever knows first wins quietly. In every era, information is power, but only for those disciplined enough to use it before anyone realizes they have it. The bank may have different names. The estate may be held through 3 layers of trusts. But scratch the surface, and you find names from 6 centuries ago. Tracing wealth through time is like following a river that vanishes underground, only to resurface miles later under a new name. Dynastic families learned long ago that money survives best when it is hidden in plain sight. Yet, if you know where to look, property deeds, genealogies, endowments, and forgotten ledgers, the current becomes visible again, glinting under centuries of dust. The evidence begins with land. In Europe, property is the most enduring fingerprint of power. Castles that once guarded trade routes still belong to the descendants of those who taxed them. In Italy, the same families who built Renaissance palazzi continue to occupy them, their names etched into marble doorways and legal registries alike. In Britain, estates granted before the Tudors still appear in the records of the Duchy of Lancaster and the land registry, sometimes now owned by corporations. But the directors' surnames tell the story. Then there are the banks. The Rothschilds began as coin dealers in Frankfurt's Jewish ghetto in the 1762. Within 3 generations, they financed governments, railways, and empires. Their public banks may have merged or rebranded, but the family's private holding companies and trusts remain, owning vineyards, art collections, and estates across Europe. The Barings, whose name once stood behind global trade and British imperial loans, collapsed in 1995, but family members still appear in London finance, politics, and philanthropy, the names simply quieter now. In Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, medieval counts and merchant houses turned their wealth into land, and land into legitimacy. Some of their descendants still live in the same Schloss, managing vineyards that have produced wine since the 14th century. In Ireland, the Guinness family brewers turned aristocrats can trace their line back to medieval chieftains, their wealth compounded not just in money but in influence. Compound interest, after all, is time's most faithful accomplice. A fortune of modest size in 1400, preserved and allowed to grow even at small annual rates, becomes astronomical after 6 centuries. But only if it is never broken apart. Families learned to protect wealth through primogeniture, passing everything to the eldest son through entailments that prevented sales, and later through trusts that kept property intact no matter how many heirs followed. Even revolutions rarely erased them completely. When fortunes were confiscated, the networks remained. Dispossessed families used knowledge, connections, and marriages to rebuild. The same names reappear, sometimes in different countries, sometimes behind new enterprises. They didn't always keep their castles, but they often kept their accountants. Today, much of this wealth resides in private family offices, invisible to public markets or rankings. Their assets include old estates, art, equity stakes in corporations, and endowments disguised as philanthropy. Occasionally, a lawsuit or leaked document exposes a glimpse, a title transfer, a trust dispute, a revelation that an old noble name quietly owns a modern conglomerate. The trail is never complete, but it's enough to see the shape of something continuous, a slow, steady accumulation, untouched by revolutions, unbothered by time. The faces change, the structures remain. They didn't just get rich and stay rich. They built the system, and now we all live in the house they designed. The fortunes of medieval banking families were not just measured in coin, but in architecture, architectures of finance, law, and governance that still surround us. The double-entry ledger, born in Florentine counting houses, became the nervous system of capitalism. The commenda contract, used by Venetian merchants to share risk and reward across oceans, evolved into the joint stock company. And the letters of credit that allowed medieval traders to move wealth across borders without touching a coin became the invisible threads of global banking. Each innovation carried a principle of control. Whoever controlled the system, its rules, its flows, its instruments, could control the players who depended on it. The Fuggers, the Medici, the Genoese bankers, they weren't merely financiers. They were engineers of structure. That structure survived the centuries, changing names but not essence. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was conceived not as a state institution, but as a private venture, a group of merchants lending to the crown in exchange for privileges. It functioned precisely as the Medici Bank once had, except its clients were now governments, not popes. The world's central banks, including the U.S. Federal Reserve, inherited that DNA. Semi-private entities that mediate between nations and the unseen owners of capital. The family names may have faded, but the logic credit as leverage over sovereignty remains untouched. Modern dynasties in finance, the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds, did not invent their strategies. They inherited them. Their ledgers expanded into bond markets and stock exchanges. Their information networks evolved into telegraph lines and news services. Yet the underlying mechanisms were the same: access, secrecy, and time. By the 19th century, the techniques born in Renaissance Florence had become the circulatory system of global capitalism. Even governance itself absorbed these methods. Medieval families blurred the line between public office and private enterprise merchants, as senators in Venice, bankers as treasurers of kingdoms. Today, that line is institutionalized. Former bankers become finance ministers. Regulators retire into corporate boards. Laws are written by those who stand to benefit most. The revolving door is not corruption, it is continuity. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank operate as heirs to the old banking networks, lending to states, attaching conditions, creating dependencies that echo the old debts of kings to their financiers. What the Fuggers once did to emperors, institutions now do to nations. Corporate governance, too, carries the Venetian imprint. Boards of directors mirror the merchant councils that once decided trading routes. Shareholders are the descendants of commenda investors, funding ventures without ever touching a ship. The corporation itself, with its immortal legal body and limited liability, is the perfected dream of dynastic survival, an entity that never dies, never ages, and never forgets who holds the keys. Even philanthropy follows ancient blueprints. The Medici commissioned cathedrals. Modern billionaires fund universities and museums. Both transform profit into legitimacy, turning private wealth into public memory. Endowments ensure their influence long after their names have faded from headlines. Today's family offices, private investment firms managing generational wealth, are almost indistinguishable from medieval banking houses. Discreet, familial, global, and eternal. They operate behind corporations, foundations, and charities, making policy not through parliaments but through markets and endowments. The institutions they built no longer need them to function. The systems outlived their creators, and that is their greatest achievement. The architecture of power has become self-sustaining, and in that sense, every transaction we make, every tax we pay, every system we trust, is still part of the house they built. Different century, different technology, same playbook. Marry strategically, control information, build networks, fund culture, capture institutions, and above all, stay quiet about it. The medieval merchant princes may be gone, but their methods have not vanished. They've simply adapted to new tools, new currencies, and new technologies. Today's dynasties don't wear crowns or coats of arms. They wear anonymity, limited liability, and well-tailored discretion. Consider the billionaire philanthropists who dominate headlines not through conquest but through benevolence. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett pledged to give away their fortunes, yet the mechanisms they created, their private foundations, ensure that wealth remains under family direction indefinitely, shielded from taxation, accountable only to themselves. It is the same logic that guided Renaissance merchants funding monasteries and hospitals under their own patronage. Turn wealth into virtue, power into permanence. Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan's initiative operates as an LLC, not a charity, a modern commenda contract. The family retains control, reaps tax advantages, and invests where morality and market overlap. The Medici would have admired such elegance, the fusion of reputation, profit, and purpose into a single instrument. Cultural legitimacy remains as valuable as gold. Just as the Fuggers built cathedrals and the Medici funded artists, today's billionaires build museums, donate to universities, and endow research centers that bear their names. These are not mere gifts, they are investments in memory. The hand that funds the archive decides what the future remembers. Modern marriage markets, too, echo medieval strategies. Heirs to technology fortunes mingle with descendants of old aristocracy, each providing what the other lacks: liquidity for lineage, lineage for legitimacy. The galas, fundraisers, and elite schools are their new courts. Romantic narratives mask the old transaction alliances between families whose combined influence multiplies both wealth and reach. Meanwhile, the machinery of finance hums with familiar rhythms. The Wallenberg family of Sweden controls vast sectors of industry through foundations and cross-shareholdings, maintaining corporate empires invisible to the casual observer. The Agnelli dynasty still steers Italy's industrial and media landscape through the same structure of trusts and preferred shares. The names may sound modern: Stellantis, Exor, but the architecture is medieval. Distributed control, limited transparency, and generational stewardship. Across the world, sovereign wealth funds and elite family offices function like miniature republics of Venice, states within states, balancing commerce and governance. They diversify across borders, industries, and ideologies, playing both sides as circumstances require. The Rothschild principle, never bet everything on one king, remains as relevant in the era of global capital as it was in the age of emperors. Information has changed shape but not purpose. The carrier pigeons of old have become algorithms. High-frequency trading firms profit from microseconds of advantage, transforming speed itself into currency. Political families thrive on early access to policy changes, leveraging data before it becomes public knowledge. As in the 15th century, information asymmetry remains the purest form of power. And through it all, discretion endures. The new merchant princes do not parade their influence, they curate it. Their companies speak more loudly than they do, Their philanthropy buys silence as much as praise. Their wealth, dispersed across foundations, trusts, and offshore havens, is everywhere and nowhere at once. The tools have changed, but the instincts have not. These dynasties understand that survival requires flexibility, legitimacy, and distance. They are heirs to a game perfected long before electricity, long before democracy, a game of quiet endurance, played across generations. And if you strip away the screens and logos, you can still see the outlines of the old empires beneath the same families, the same structures, the same calm, deliberate choreography of power that never needs to announce itself. The most powerful conspiracy is the one hiding in plain sight. Systems legally designed to protect existing power, operating exactly as intended. When people notice patterns, names that reappear, fortunes that never vanish, networks that seem to rule from behind curtains, they reach instinctively for the word conspiracy. It's an understandable reaction. The web of connections, stretching from medieval merchant dynasties to modern billionaires, can feel too precise, too continuous to be coincidence. But the truth is subtler and far more difficult to dismantle. The patterns are real, the coordination is not. Power doesn't need secret handshakes when it has structure. Families facing the same incentives make the same choices. They study what worked before, copy proven strategies, and move within systems already shaped by those who came earlier. The result looks like orchestration, but its evolution, millions of small, rational moves accumulating into design. Medieval bankers didn't plan a 600-year conspiracy. They simply built tools that rewarded those who owned them. Double-entry ledgers, trusts, corporations, and contracts, all designed for efficiency and preservation, became self-perpetuating machines. Once created, they didn't need a puppet master. They only needed participants acting in their own interest. That doesn't mean the world's elite never coordinate. They do openly, at conferences, summits, and private forums that function like modern guild meetings. The World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg. These are spaces where the powerful exchange information, not plot domination. Yet influence flows from familiarity. People who golf together, dine together, and send their children to the same schools rarely imagine the world differently. Alignment replaces conspiracy. Conspiracy thinking thrives because it offers drama, villains, secrets, and the promise that if only the hidden cabal were exposed, the world would right itself. But the reality is colder. The mechanisms concentrating wealth are written into law, defended by tradition, and celebrated as efficiency. The system isn't broken. It functions perfectly for those it was built to serve. Scholars who map elite networks find continuity, not coordination, overlapping board memberships, intermarried dynasties, revolving doors between government and finance. No secret orders are required. Power simply flows along the channels carved long ago. The danger of seeing conspiracy everywhere is that it distracts from what truly needs reform. The problem isn't secret plots, it's visible inertia. Legal, cultural, and financial systems keep wealth where it has always been, not because someone hides the truth, but because no one in power has reason to change it. Perhaps that is the deepest mystery of all, a world shaped not by shadowy masterminds, but by ordinary self-interest repeating itself, generation after generation, until the pattern itself becomes invisible. Every system produces winners. The question is, must the same families keep winning across centuries, or can we build systems where each generation starts more equally? Perhaps what we've uncovered isn't corruption, but biology. In every environment, ecological, economic, or social resources gather in clusters. A tree that grows tall captures more sunlight. A person who gains early advantage collects more opportunities. Over time, advantage compounds into dominance. Wealth behaves the same way as gravity. It attracts more of itself. Across human history, these accumulations have repeated with unnerving precision. In agrarian societies, landowners rose above laborers. In industrial societies, Capital owners rose above workers. In digital economies, data owners rise above users. The technologies change, but the slope of the curve remains the same. Power pools where knowledge, coordination, and inheritance intersect. Some say this is simply how the game is designed. Wherever resources can be stored and transferred, a few will find ways to store more and pass it down. Wherever information is imperfect, those who know first will profit most. And wherever humans form groups, relationships will become currency. The logic is ancient, perhaps even evolutionary. Behaviors that protect and expand advantage survive. Those that don't vanish. History offers proof. Every revolution that promised equality eventually produced a new elite. The Bolsheviks dismantled aristocracy, but built a party hierarchy. Democratic movements expanded participation, yet wealth and lobbying soon captured the new institutions. Even when power changes hands, it tends to settle in familiar shapes, centralized, hereditary, self-reinforcing. Yet inevitability is not the same as permanence. There are counterexamples, societies that designed mechanisms to blunt accumulation. Indigenous communities that practiced redistribution ceremonies where wealth was deliberately destroyed to prevent dominance. Cooperative movements that kept ownership dispersed. Modern democracies that built welfare states, unions, and progressive taxation to balance advantage. These structures show that while the gravitational pull of inequality is strong, it can be resisted. Patterns repeat because conditions allow them to. Medieval oligarchies thrived in worlds of fragmented authority and weak oversight. Today's global elite flourishes in a system with complex finance, weak taxation, and opaque laws. But just as rules once created these hierarchies, new rules could alter them. Transparency reforms can weaken information monopolies. Strong democratic institutions can resist capture. Broad civic participation can create accountability where secrecy once ruled. Perhaps power always concentrates, but the degree, the shape, and the consequences are choices. Each era decides how much accumulation it will tolerate, how much inequality it will sanctify, and how far the latter reaches before it vanishes into clouds. If history teaches us anything, it's this. Power follows patterns, but patterns are not fate. Once seen clearly, they can be changed. They've spent centuries perfecting invisibility. Maybe it's time we insisted on seeing clearly. In every era, the most enduring form of power has been opacity, the ability to act without being seen, to profit without being named, to own without appearing to own. The medieval bankers hid behind monarchs. The papal families cloaked their fortunes in piety. The Venetian merchants encoded their trade routes in secret ledgers. Today's elites use different disguises, shell companies, trusts, and offshore accounts, but the logic is the same. If no one can see the structure, no one can challenge it. Information asymmetry built empires then, and it sustains them now. In the 15th century, a family that knew which kingdom would go to war could buy copper before the armies marched. In the 21st, a hedge fund that knows tomorrow's policy shift can move billions before dawn. Power doesn't just depend on what you own. It depends on what you know first and what you can hide longest. Modern opacity has evolved into an art form. Family offices managing billions face almost no public reporting requirements. Trusts, registered in offshore havens, conceal the real owners behind layers of paperwork. Corporations own other corporations in spirals so intricate even regulators lose the trail. When wealth disappears into complexity, accountability follows it. Technology was supposed to end secrecy. Instead, it multiplied it. Money now moves through digital channels at the speed of light beyond the reach of borders, governments, or journalists. Blockchain records transactions, but anonymous wallets obscure identities. Artificial intelligence monitors everything, yet the algorithms themselves are black boxes. The more data we create, the less we seem to understand who controls it. There have been moments when the curtain lifted. The Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers. Leaked files revealing the elaborate architecture of hidden wealth, politicians, royals, and business magnates, all woven into the same offshore web. For a brief moment, the invisible world became visible. And then, almost as quickly, it disappeared again beneath new layers of secrecy, new jurisdictions, new names. Transparency flashes like lightning, bright enough to illuminate, too brief to burn. True transparency would mean something different. It would require global rules, registries that reveal who owns what, disclosures for private wealth comparable to public companies, and limits on the labyrinthine structures that exist purely to obscure. It would mean recognizing that privacy for ordinary citizens is not the same as secrecy for billionaires. The resistance to such transparency tells us everything. When exposure threatens power, the powerful will always call it intrusion. Yet without light, no system, economic, political, or moral, can remain legitimate for long. The families of the past survived because they could disappear into complexity. Perhaps our era's greatest test is whether we can learn to see through it, to make visibility not a threat, but a condition for trust. We rejected the idea that political power should be inherited, but we accept that economic power should pass from parent to child indefinitely. Why? Inheritance is the invisible bridge that carries power across centuries. Every generation pretends to begin anew, yet most are simply walking roads paved long before they were born. Medieval dynasties perfected the practice primogeniture, trusts, dowries, and entailments, ensuring that wealth never left the bloodline. The result was continuity disguised as fate. The same pattern persists. Only the paperwork has changed. In theory, we live in meritocracies. In practice, inheritance still decides much of the race before the starting gun fires. A family that owns capital owns options, better education, safer neighborhoods, early investments, and networks that open doors before effort begins. Compounding returns don't stop with money, they extend to experience, expectation, and connection. The logic seems simple. Parents want to provide for their children, but what begins as love becomes structure. A system where every generation starts at different heights can't call itself fair, no matter how free it seems. History is filled with attempts to correct this. Some societies imposed heavy inheritance taxes, forcing each generation to rebuild rather than merely receive. Others redistributed land or property after revolutions. Yet, somehow, dynasties re-emerged, sometimes the same families under new names. The mechanisms of transmission adapt faster than the laws that try to contain them. Foundations replace feudal titles. Family offices replace hereditary estates. The arguments for inheritance endure. Continuity stabilizes businesses, protects family enterprises, rewards responsibility. But the arguments against grow stronger as wealth becomes more concentrated. When fortunes reach planetary scale, inheritance ceases to be about family, it becomes about power without consent. A child born into a dynasty may one day wield more influence than elected governments, not through achievement, but through birthright. Imagine if wealth reset each generation, not erased, but redistributed through trust funds for all citizens, or basic capital grants that gave everyone a chance to begin with dignity. The scale of possibility would shift overnight. Merit would matter more when starting lines aligned. Opportunity would no longer depend on ancestry. Even medieval societies, for all their inequality, had resets, wars, plagues, and political upheavals that periodically leveled hierarchies. Modern systems, insulated by finance and law, rarely allow such resets. Wealth now compounds quietly, century after century, invisible yet unstoppable. Inheritance is not destiny, it's design, and designs can be rewritten. The question is whether we will. Because as long as dynastic wealth flows unbroken, democracy remains half-built, a political equality resting on economic feudalism. Maybe we can't change this. Maybe dynastic power is too entrenched, too adaptable, too good at protecting itself. Or maybe that's exactly what they want us to believe. Every civilization reaches a moment when it realizes that knowledge alone is not enough. Seeing the pattern doesn't change the pattern. The powerful have always known this. They survive not just by wealth or secrecy, but by shaping belief, by convincing others that change is either impossible or dangerous. If everyone accepts the system as inevitable, it doesn't need to be defended. It sustains itself. Modern democracy was supposed to break that spell. Yet even the most open societies find themselves hemmed in by invisible walls. Campaigns cost fortunes. Media depends on advertising. Laws are written by those who can afford lobbyists to whisper them into existence. The names change, but the structure remains familiar. It's the old papal palace rebuilt in glass and steel. Still, there have been moments when the cycle cracked. The reformers of the progressive era who dismantled monopolies. The architects of post-war Europe who built social safety nets from the rubble. The activists who forced civil rights into law. Each time, ordinary people organized across divides, long enough and loud enough to make the system blink. The victories were never perfect, never permanent, but they proved something vital. Elites can adapt, but they can also be challenged. The challenge is time. Concentrated power plays the long game. Families think in generations, democracies think in election cycles. By the time outrage cools and reforms fade, old structures reassemble, quietly, behind the curtain. If change is to last, it must be built into the bones of the system, transparent laws, strong institutions, education that teaches not just facts but power literacy. Technology could be either the weapon or the wall. The same networks that spread disinformation can organize truth. The same digital systems that track our every move can track corruption, if we choose to use them that way. Artificial intelligence could centralize control or distribute it, depending on who owns the code. The tools exist. The question is ownership. Perhaps we can't overthrow dynastic power outright, but we can erode its invisibility. We can question what we've been taught to accept, and we can build systems that remember what the old ones forgot. That legitimacy comes not from lineage, but from trust. Change begins not with revolution, but with recognition, with the quiet realization that no family, no institution, no history is unchangeable. Power depends on belief. Withdraw the belief, and even the oldest empires begin to crack. And maybe, just maybe, that's where change truly starts, not in the palace, but in the mind that finally decides to see.